He stood there, quiet and dignified, as her words cut through the air like venom. "People like you shouldn't be allowed in places like this," she sneered. Her designer sunglasses perched on her head like a crown. But what happened next left her and her entire group completely speechless, questioning everything they thought they knew about power, privilege, and respect. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the pristine paths of the Whispering Pines Wildlife Sanctuary, one of the most prestigious conservation centers in Vermont. The crisp October air carried the sweet scent of maple leaves and distant wildlife. Marcus Thompson adjusted his navy blue volunteer jacket, smoothing out the creases as he prepared for another day of guiding visitors through the sanctuary's sprawling grounds. At 72, Marcus had seen his fair share of life's ugliness and beauty. His weathered hands told stories of battles fought in far-off lands, of medals earned and sacrifices made. But here, among the peaceful grounds of the sanctuary, he had found his calling, sharing his deep knowledge of wildlife with visitors from around the world. The morning had started like any other, with families and nature enthusiasts eagerly gathering for the day's first tour. But then she arrived. Catherine Wellington strode through the sanctuary's entrance like she owned it, her Gucci heels clicking against the stone pathway, flanked by her equally well-dressed friends Jennifer and Sarah. Marcus watched as they approached the gathering point, their voices carrying across the peaceful morning air. Catherine's laugh, sharp and artificial, cut through the natural sounds of the sanctuary. "I can't believe we're actually doing this," she announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Daddy usually arranges private tours at places like this." Sarah touched Catherine's arm, pointing toward Marcus. "Look at our guide," she whispered, not bothering to lower her voice enough. "Isn't there someone else available? Someone more suitable?" Marcus maintained his composure, decades of military discipline evident in his straight posture and calm demeanor. He had faced bullets in Vietnam. He could handle the prejudice of entitled tourists. But what these women didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that their assumptions about him were about to shatter their entire worldview. Catherine approached the group, positioning herself front and center, her designer purse swinging carelessly. Her eyes swept over Marcus with the kind of dismissive glance reserved for those she deemed beneath her. "Excuse me," she called out, her tone dripping with condescension. "We were expecting a more qualified guide. No offense, but this is a prestigious sanctuary, and we'd prefer someone with actual expertise." The other visitors shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. The sanctuary's peace was now pierced by the tension in the air. Marcus simply smiled, a gentle expression that carried years of wisdom behind it. "Good morning, ma'am," he responded, his voice steady and warm. "I'd be happy to share my credentials if you'd like." Catherine let out an exaggerated sigh. "I'm sure you're very nice," she said, speaking slowly as if addressing a child. "But we paid good money for this experience. We deserve someone who actually knows what they're talking about. Someone more professional." Jennifer snickered behind her hand, while Sarah pulled out her phone, already typing what would undoubtedly be a scathing review. What they didn't notice was the slight twinkle in Marcus's eyes, the kind that spoke of a story waiting to be told. Little did they know, their morning at the Whispering Pines Wildlife Sanctuary was about to become a lesson they'd never forget. Because Marcus Thompson wasn't just any guide, and the path they were about to walk would lead them to confront their prejudices in ways they never expected. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the promise of revelations to come. The stage was set for a confrontation that would leave Catherine and her friends questioning everything they thought they knew about authority, respect, and the true meaning of expertise. Catherine wasn't finished. As Marcus began leading the group along the sanctuary's winding path, she made it her mission to undermine every word he spoke. "Excuse me," she interrupted, as Marcus explained the delicate ecosystem of the sanctuary's wolf habitat. "Are you sure about that? Because I watched a documentary last week that said something completely different." Marcus continued calmly, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. "The wolves here at Whispering Pines have their own unique patterns. I've observed them daily for the past 15 years. 15 years of watching animals doesn't make you an expert, Catherine scoffed, turning to her friends. My cousin's husband is a real wildlife biologist. He has actual degrees. Sarah nodded enthusiastically, her diamond earrings catching the morning light. Exactly. I mean, no offense, but shouldn't you be doing something more appropriate for your background? The other tourists in the group shifted uncomfortably. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering, Mom, why are those ladies being so mean? Marcus led them deeper into the sanctuary, past the serene lake where a family of swans glided across the water. He pointed out a rare species of eagle nesting in the distance, explaining its migration patterns and behaviors. His knowledge was precise, detailed, and clearly born from years of careful study. But Catherine wasn't interested in learning. Jennifer, she whispered to her friend, can you believe this? We paid premium prices for this tour, and they sent us someone who probably learned everything from watching Animal Planet. Jennifer pulled out her phone, snapping photos of the scenery while barely listening to Marcus's explanations. I know, right? Like, shouldn't there be some kind of standard? I mean, look at him. He's ancient. The disrespect continued as they reached the Big Cat enclosure. Marcus was explaining the rehabilitation program for injured mountain lions when Catherine cut him off again. Oh, please. She rolled her eyes. What would you know about rehabilitation programs? Did you read that in a brochure? A few other visitors began to drift away from Catherine's group, embarrassed by her behavior. But she seemed to take their discomfort as encouragement, her voice growing louder, more insistent. If you're finding this story as compelling as others have, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The conclusion will leave you speechless. I just think, Catherine announced, adjusting her designer sunglasses, that certain positions should be reserved for people who are actually qualified. Don't you agree, Sarah? Sarah nodded, her perfectly manicured nails tapping away at her phone. Totally. I mean, no offense, but this is supposed to be like a premium experience. Marcus maintained his composure, continuing to share his vast knowledge of the sanctuary's wildlife. He pointed out subtle behaviors in the animals that only someone with intimate knowledge would notice. But with each observation, Catherine found a way to dismiss or challenge him. That's not what Google says. She smirked, waving her phone in the air. Maybe you should update your information. The tour continued to the sanctuary's pride and joy, a rehabilitation center for endangered species. As they approached the building, Catherine's comments grew even more pointed. I suppose you just clean up around here, right? The real experts must be inside. Marcus smiled, that same knowing smile that had played at his lips all morning. He reached for his keys. Not the basic set that regular guides carried, but a master set that opened every door in the facility. Catherine's eyes narrowed. Where did you get those? Should you really have access to everything? As Marcus opened the door to the rehabilitation center, a young woman in a white coat looked up from her clipboard. Her face broke into a wide smile. Dr. Thompson, I was hoping you'd stop by. We could really use your expertise with our new arrival. Catherine's perfectly painted lips parted in surprise. Doctor. But before Marcus could respond, a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit emerged from one of the offices. Marcus, he called out warmly. I was just about to call you. The National Geographic team is here to finish up that documentary about your work. 30 years of wildlife conservation, 3 pitches, and 2 decades of revolutionary research. You're making us all look lazy. The color drained from Catherine's face. Sarah stopped typing on her phone. Jennifer's jaw dropped. But the revelations weren't finished. The man continued, Oh, and the Secretary of Defense's office called again. They want to do another ceremony for your Medal of Honor. 4th one, isn't it? Something about your unit in Vietnam and that rescue mission. Catherine's world seemed to tilt on its axis. The same man she had spent the morning belittling stood before her, his credentials hanging in the air like a heavyweight champion's title belt. But Marcus Thompson wasn't done teaching his lesson in humility. Actually, Richard, Marcus addressed the man in the suit, his voice carrying the same gentle authority it had all morning. It's the 3rd Medal of Honor. The fourth was the Presidential Medal of Freedom for the conservation program we developed for endangered species. Richard chuckled, shaking his head. My mistake. Hard to keep track of all your accolades, old friend. The young scientist who had greeted them earlier turned to the group, her eyes shining with admiration. We're so fortunate to have Dr. Thompson here. His research on wildlife rehabilitation has literally written the textbooks most of us studied in university. That documentary you mentioned earlier about wolf behavior. She looked directly at Catherine. He was the lead researcher. Catherine stood frozen, her designer handbag hanging limply at her side. The morning's events played through her mind like a horror movie where she was the villain. Every dismissive comment, every rolling of her eyes, every whispered insult. They all came rushing back with crushing clarity. Sarah had stopped typing her review, her phone forgotten in her hand. Jennifer couldn't even manage her usual nervous laughter. The other tourists who had witnessed Catherine's behavior throughout the morning were now watching with a mixture of satisfaction and secondhand embarrassment. Marcus turned to Catherine and her friends, his expression still kind, devoid of the smugness they would have shown in his position. You know, he said thoughtfully, I found that wildlife and humans aren't so different. Both can be quick to judge based on appearances, but both are also capable of learning and growing. He gestured to a nearby enclosure where a magnificent bald eagle perched. Take Regina here. When she first arrived, she was aggressive, defensive. She'd been hurt by humans and didn't trust any of us. But with patience and respect, she learned that appearances can be deceiving. Catherine swallowed hard, her throat tight with shame. Dr. Thompson, I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything, Marcus replied gently. But perhaps you might want to listen, not just to me, but to everyone you meet. Every person has a story, expertise, and wisdom to share, regardless of how they look or what assumptions we might make about them. Richard stepped forward, still smiling. Marcus here doesn't usually talk about his achievements. Did you know he turned down a position as Secretary of Wildlife Conservation? Said he preferred to stay here, giving tours, working directly with the animals and teaching people about them. Something about the importance of ground-level education. The young scientist nodded enthusiastically. He's mentored most of the leading researchers in our field. That cousin's husband you mentioned. She looked at Catherine. If he's a wildlife biologist under 50, he probably studied Dr. Thompson's work. Marcus raised his hand modestly. The work speaks for itself. Just like the animals we protect here, they don't need fancy introductions or credentials to prove their worth. They simply are who they are, doing what they do best. If you've stayed with us this far, you won't want to miss our other stories about extraordinary individuals who challenge our preconceptions. Hit that subscribe button now. Catherine's designer sunglasses had long since been put away, her superior attitude replaced by genuine humility. Dr. Thompson, she began, her voice small. Would it be possible to start the tour over? This time I promised to actually listen. Marcus smiled, that same gentle smile he'd worn all morning. Of course, there's always something new to learn at Whispering Pines. Even after 30 years, these animals still surprise me every day. As they began the tour anew, Catherine and her friends hung on every word. The same knowledge they had dismissed an hour ago now seemed precious, each observation a gift from a man they had grievously underestimated. The autumn sun continued its arc across the sky, its warm light touching everything at Whispering Pines Wildlife Sanctuary. The animals, the trees, and a group of people learning that wisdom and excellence don't always come in the packages we expect. That day, Catherine Wellington learned a lesson more valuable than any luxury she'd ever bought. True authority doesn't need to announce itself. Real expertise doesn't seek validation, and respect, once lost, must be earned back through humility and genuine change. As the tour concluded, Catherine approached Marcus one last time. Dr. Thompson, I know an apology isn't enough, but I am truly sorry. You've taught me more than just about wildlife today. Marcus nodded, understanding in his eyes. Then the day has been well spent. Remember, Mrs. Wellington, life's greatest teachers often come in unexpected forms. Sometimes they have fur and feathers. He gestured to the sanctuary around them. And sometimes they're the very people we're quickest to dismiss. The story of Marcus Thompson and Catherine Wellington's encounter at Whispering Pines spread far beyond the sanctuary's borders. A powerful reminder that respect isn't given because of titles or wealth, but earned through character and actions. And somewhere in Vermont, a decorated veteran with 3 PhDs still leads tours, sharing his wisdom with anyone willing to learn, regardless of their first impressions. Because in the end, it's not about who we appear to be, but who we truly are. And sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the people we least expect to teach them.